All right, calling the subcommittee hearing back to order, and I appreciate the witnesses' indulgence. Obviously, vote schedule is beyond our control. Having said that, I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Everett, so DOE has its CDM dashboard up and running. Can you give us a sense of what the value is of the data that you're now realizing from Phase 1 CDM, what the capabilities are? What's different now that that's operational?
So we're just starting to pull the value out of that. We've got our IJC3, which is essentially our sort of our enterprise SOC. Again, very frankly, one of our challenges is our scope of where we have CDM installed is limited at this point. It gives me visibility in the services that I traditionally have provisioned that are primarily to all our federal employees is what it covers. What it's doing is it is starting to give us the picture of, again, what our internal vulnerabilities look like. You know, as Kevin talked about, is our actual vulnerability and patch management. Start to give us a picture of what our prioritization should be about not only patching, but about which systems are going to be no longer supported, which systems are out of date, some of those things. The real value for us, frankly, is as we start to expand it across our enterprise to the PMAs and other folks. And again, many of our labs and sites already have the capabilities. We have not tied them together as an enterprise.
Okay. So are you lacking any authorities that would have allowed you to do that faster that you need now to sort of roll it out on a more expedited and take advantage of it on a more expedited basis?
So I think for me, I can say very fortunately the answer is no. At this point, you know, again, I report directly to the Secretary and Deputy Secretary, and that was changed right after I came on in August. That's been a huge improvement, and I have their direct, firm push that we need to do this. They understand very well that we've got to know what's on our networks. That's the first step in some basic cybersecurity hygiene.
Okay.
So I've got that full authority.
So then let me shift to you, Mr. Garcia, because you're a little further along the curve. So same question regarding the new data or better data that the CDM is providing.
So again, just to echo what Mr. Everett said, was we were able to see across the spectrum. We can see end-of-life systems out there. We can see items that are requiring patches. We can see operating systems that are end of life, and we can see the progress we made with our patch updates as well. Okay.
So in addition to your current role, you have pretty considerable private sector experience, and we're always trying to leverage what innovative companies are doing. Are there any short-term recommendations that you would make or could make from that experience that might speed up the deployment of CDM capabilities?
That's a great question, and since I've been with OPM since October, been trying to think how do we expedite things? How do we move things faster? I feel like we're always kind of behind the 8 ball in government deployment, and I think a lot of it has to do with the bureaucracy and trying to navigate that, and I understand there's a balance that has to be reached in the need to be fully accountable for taxpayer dollars, but at some point I think there's got to be mechanisms that we can strike a balance that will enable us to move faster on some of these.
So what would those milestones be that are out there that we can look for to know that we're on track, that we're getting, that we're making progress, you know, with respect to an effective structure for, you know, defending the federal IT infrastructure?
Quite honestly, I think that CDM does provide that. If you look at Phase 1 and Phase 2, they're addressing a lot of the NIST controls that are in place, and Phase 3 is moving towards that more agency focus, with the goal in Phase 4 to move into that continual monitoring of the network. I think those are good mile markers.
Well, so let me roll that into a question for you, Mr. Cox, in terms of, you know, we all want CDM to be a force multiplier for network defenders. what's the 3-year plan to get there, and how do we know that we're getting there? What can I look at as a member of Congress with oversight to say, hey, we're on track or we're not on track, and hold you accountable?
I'll take that as two questions. First, in terms of what we're looking over the next 3 to 6 years, is with our CDM Defend contracting mechanism. We have the flexibility built in to work with the agencies to see what their priorities are at that point in time, be able to get teams in from the integrator that owns the contract to help get the solutions deployed more quickly and being more nimble in terms of what the agency's needs are. In terms of metrics, really looking at what we've accomplished so far and what we will be moving towards is, to this point, getting the visibility across the networks, starting out looking at the numbers of assets that were reported manually. We found a 75% increase in terms of the total number of assets once we got automated tools into the environment. From a cost saving standpoint, by being able to do volume purchasing of the tools, we found that we achieved savings upwards of 70% off of IT Schedule 70. In terms of where we're headed and being able to measure the mission impacts of CDM, we want to be able to get full visibility both at the agency level for the agencies as well as at the federal level, and then be able to see what their overall cyber hygiene is, their security posture, and ultimately be able to help manage for the agencies at the agency level and us at the federal level the risk across the federal enterprise.
Terrific. Thanks very much. My time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you for this joint hearing, and thank the witnesses for being instructive and insightful. I think we have a lot on our plate, and certainly Mr. Cox, from the areas that you deal with, is a particular concern, and certainly the Office of Personnel Management, and we're delighted that the Veterans Affairs is getting on track. But let me recite what I've done for a number of years. Just a historical perspective, this committee was included in something called Transportation Security and Infrastructure, so we began talking about these issues almost a decade ago. We're probably behind, but I'm glad to see where we are today. So I'll pose some questions initially and then some pointed questions, but I think we've made great strides. And I emphasize the point that I wanted to make is that we have a small percentage of the cyber, and most of it is in the private sector, and a lot of that impacts the government agencies. And I think the more that we're engaged, I introduced legislation that was passed, and I thank the committee that dealt with zero-day events, and part of it was the consulting with the private sector on what might be helpful to them or what might be helpful to you that may be classified. So I would ask this question. As you know, one of the challenges with federal cybersecurity is that new technologies are being developed much faster than the federal procurement cycle allows. What should we be doing to make sure that the CDM program is flexible and agile enough to keep pace? Why don't I, and I appreciated pithy answers. I'm trying to get to all of you. Why don't I start with Mr. Cox and then go to Mr. Garcia with OPM because of the unfortunate major snafu impacting our federal employees. Mr. Cox?
Yes, Congresswoman. We've approached the ability to bring on new technologies, new innovations more quickly in two ways. First, through the CDM Defend task order by awarding a long-term task order of 5 to 6 years. It enables us to continue to issue requests for service to that integrator for different types of technology, different types of need more quickly, and rather than having to recompete a new contract. Secondly, through our approved products list, we have accelerated the pace at which vendors, industry can submit new products to the approved products list. On a monthly basis, vendors can submit those to us. Working with our staff, we assess those quickly, and then if the products meet the criteria, they're quickly added. and that enables agencies to get to those products more quickly.
Mr. Garcia?
Thank you for the question. So I think the focus for us in coming out of the events of 2014 and 2015 was how do we, if we need to buy something to address a zero-day, but we need a vendor, we need a service, we need software, we need hardware, how do we shorten the procurement time to bring these tools to bear as quickly as possible?
Absolutely. And Mr. Garcia, got you right on the spot here. Does this either flexibility or attentiveness to moving forward include and embrace small and minority women-owned businesses in the context of how the federal government utilizes, so they're not shut out of the door because of their size?
That's a great question. So as a former 8A program member, I would say absolutely to that question.
That they have the opportunity.
Absolutely.
Let me go right to Mr. For the Veterans Affairs, Mr. Blackburn. Thank you for your service. We lived in a nightmare as our veterans were either dying or not being able to get served, and we know that it is certainly an old agency, and it deals with older patients who deserve our honor and respect. What have you been able to do to cure that devastating experience that veterans have had and languishing in hallways waiting on doctors or not getting their doctor appointments?
Well, that nightmare is why I joined after 2014. I was as shocked and disgusted as anybody, and we've really pushed hard on shortening wait times so that we now have same-day access in all of our sites. We've really doubled down on customer service, self-service tools. I schedule my appointments now using an online tool. So we're using technology, we're staffing, we're focusing on the biggest problems to make sure that never happens again.
My two last questions, which I'd like all of you to answer, is what do you view as the greatest promise on the CDM for the federal network? But as you answer that, please, I've introduced another piece of legislation to improve the cyber professional staff for the federal government. If that would be helpful to you, you might acknowledge that. But the final question, that question is number one, about what's the greatest promise. The other one is, in the backdrop of this hearing, we have an unfortunate discovery of the entity with Facebook, Cambridge, and the misuse of millions of emails or data of Americans. My question would be, we don't want to be in that position. What relationship should the government have? We use these tools, Facebook, Google, and I would hope we never acknowledge that they've gotten bigger than us in terms of being able to overrun what are legitimate responsibilities of the government to protect the American people. So if you would answer how our interface would be with these giants, because we have the most and highest responsibility, and that is to the American people. You want to start, Mr. Everett?
Yes, ma'am. I think on your first question, I think aside from just the value of the tools themselves, I think one of the greatest promises long-term for the CDM program ultimately should be the ability for us at the federal enterprise level to start to share information together. I think that's just an opportunity that we have not taken full advantage of. I understand it's part of the purpose of DHS being given that role as a coordinator, that we as a federal, that we're all seeing different perspectives of the cyber threat. And I think that CDM longer term provides an avenue that we can share that information across the entire federal enterprise to help protect each other. As to your other question, I would just say I think that's a challenge not just for us in government, but certainly culturally, is helping people understand the privacy issues and how that ties into our security. As somebody who did this and used to talk to people in the private sector and try and give some training, most of us, even as professionals in this, very often don't really think about the implications of some of the tools we use on our privacy, and then what in turn that does to our security. So I think that probably takes longer looking at across the federal enterprise and making sure that privacy is a part of our discussion of security, because they do, the bad guys typically want to misuse those kind of tools to get into our networks and do other things. And so we need to tie those together.
Thank you. Mr. Blackburn?
To me, the promise of CDM, it's really moving from a reactive posture to a proactive posture. A little less than a year ago, the WannaCry virus targeted us as well as many others. And we luckily had the patches in place and fared well, but the UK healthcare system, for example, not so much. We don't know what the next threats are going to be. We have to stay on top of that, proactive, and find those before they hurt us. On the second question, I agree completely with Mr. Everett. What I would add on to that is, have the relationship with those giants, the Facebooks, the Googles, and making sure that we are constantly having sharing the best practices and making sure that we are incorporating those things. But also to your other point that you made a little bit earlier, which is those companies were small and innovative, and a lot of the great companies that have created such great platforms have come out of that small, agile, innovative. So make sure that we're also providing opportunities for those types of companies as well to induce like the best practices.
Yes, Mr. Garcia again.
Gentlelady's time's expired, but Mr. Garcia and Mr. Cox, we weigh in very quickly if you can.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
So to the first question, promise, I'd have to agree with my colleagues. I think sharing along with reciprocity and interagency agreements, if we could standardize these things, I think it would do a great value to the federal government. As to the second question, I feel a bit uneasy to answer the question due to the fact I'm not fully aware of what's Facebook's public data policies with their open data and what agreements they had in place. And I don't know if it's really fair for me as an OPM and representative of the government to really comment on that without that knowledge.
Thank you, Mr.
Yes, Congresswoman, what the real key for us to echo what Mr. Blackburn said is to get from a reactive stance to a proactive. We want to get out in front of the threat. We want to take the low-hanging fruit out of the equation and be able to enable these agencies as well as all agencies with the visibility of their networks to be able to see where the threat is and shut it down. Again, like Mr. Garcia said, I don't feel that I'm in a good position to comment specifically on the Facebook case, but I would say that it is important for us to continue to build our partnerships with industry, to interact with them, learn what they're doing. We can share our lessons as well, and we as a nation continue to get better. Thank you.
Yield back time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlelady. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thanks for being here. I got a question for Mr. Cox. Does CDM, will you be looking from DHS from an enterprise-wide DHS, or will it be all the sub-agencies doing CDM, and how do you integrate that? So I'm sort of nosy on that.
Certainly, and the idea is that each component or operational division in each agency will be able to have the visibility for their particular mission area and their particular component. So specifically with DHS, we're working, our program office is working with the DHS Office of the CIO, similar to as we work with the agencies here, to help them get the solutions out, help them build the partnerships with the components, so that they, the CIO's office, get the visibility across DHS, but at the same time, the components within DHS get that same visibility for their component space.
Will you have our enterprise-wide visibility and see the integration or get the synergy out of that?
That's correct. So while each component will have visibility for their component, that information is aggregated up at the object level. So
Right.
the Office of the CIO will be able to see individual devices, individual systems.
Right.
And then what we're doing from the agency level up to the federal level is summarizing that data. So at the federal level, what we're seeing is a summary view, but with enough information that we can work with the agencies to respond to particular issues or incidents.
Does this take advantage of commercial off-the-shelf technology pretty readily?
It does. That's a core principle of the program. We didn't want to do a lot of customized builds here. We wanted commercial off the shelf, that the product could be put in place quickly, the agency could learn it quickly, and be able to get value from it immediately.
One question for you, but maybe applicable for everybody, but I'll just get your perspective. Will the automation help you reduce some manpower requirements by this? So do you get some savings where you can redirect people?
That's exactly right. That's the idea, is that we change these manual processes that we followed for so long, get automated data so we can make better decisions more quickly, and then those folks that were doing that manual assessment work before, we can reassign those efforts to security operations and being able to help identify the threat and get in front of it.
This next question really is for you and Mr. Everett. One of the things that disturbs me most, and I'm not sure how applicable right now it is to CDM, but I'm going to give you a chance to touch on it, is the vulnerability of our energy grid. I'm not sure which portfolio it falls in. Now, I was afraid to talk about it too much until yesterday. Now all this data has been released saying just how vulnerable our energy grid is. I mean, it was thought because there are so many, such a fragmented system out there, how would the Russians and Chinese devote the manpower to get in there and really attack this? But with yesterday's release, we see they are trying to do that. How does CDM help either one of you go after this huge threat? Does it facilitate, or does it directly help or indirectly?
I'll start and provide the program's perspective and then turn it over to Mr. Everett. Our idea is that we want to provide Mr. Everett and the rest of the agencies the visibility of their network, be able to get vulnerabilities quickly patched, get systems properly configured to reduce the likelihood that an adversary can easily get into that system. We then want to help the agencies get visibility across their network so that they can detect any attacks to their network, any threats in their network, and address them quickly.
But we wouldn't be able to help if the Russians or Chinese were attacking our energy grid itself, because it's separate from the network right now. Would that be correct? Is that an accurate statement?
The idea is that if any adversary is trying to get in on the network, that we want to be able to ensure the agencies have full visibility of their network to see where that attack might be coming in. Even if it's coming in from a third party, we want to be able to see where that interface from that third party is coming into the agency network so that the agency can properly respond and quickly respond to shut it down.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Everett.
So I think I'll actually start. Obviously, our department is very focused on that as a sector-specific agency. We work very closely with our colleagues at DHS. While my focus is primarily our internal cybersecurity, the fact is I have part of the electric sector and the electric grid in our department through our Power Marketing Administration. So it is very critical to us, and we try and leverage that understanding and knowledge in our work with the sector. I'll tell you, frankly, almost even a little more practically, one of the values of things like CDM is our credibility with the sector only goes as far as our actual capability. So to the degree that we're doing it well as a federal government, then we have a leg to stand on when we go and talk to the sector and other folks. To the degree we don't, they're likely not going to take us very seriously. And that's really how we're trying to approach it at DOE, is that we're trying to make sure that if we're doing it well, then we have something to say and something of value to bring out to the private sector, which is important. And so that's one of several reasons that we take this very seriously. And we think that our experience with tools like CDM, we want to be able to then sit at the table with them and share that, because we do think tools like CDM, they are relevant to the private sector. Maybe not as the program itself, but the capabilities, the practices and experience are very relevant, and we think they'll help.
And I'll just close because I know we're out of time, and just say, I've known about this for a while, the vulnerability of our energy grid, and I think it's very alarming. I think it's the next December 7th won't be airplanes with torpedoes coming at Pearl Harbor. It's going to be triggered with an attack on our energy grid with rolling blackouts and chaos. And so you got a tough job, but look forward to supporting you in this effort because we got to start working on the resilience of our energy grid. So I appreciate hearing the connection with CDM and this threat to us. Thank you.
Thanks, gentlemen. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, for 5 minutes.
Is that better? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony here today. Mr. Cox, if I could start with you, the report to the President on IT modernization notes that CDM has not sought to address cloud-hosted systems, and that a challenge in implementing CDM capabilities in a more cloud-friendly architecture is that security teams and security operations centers may not necessarily have the expertise available to defend the updated architecture. Do you view CDM as having applicability to cloud architectures, or will it continue to focus on on-premise networks?
Congressman, yes, indeed. We want to be able to ensure the agencies have visibility wherever their data is to that data, how it's being used, how it's being protected. So as we move into phase 3 of CDM, in understanding what's happening on the network, we want to ensure we're providing the agencies capabilities to not only get on-premise visibility of their data and their networks, but wherever that data is, whether it's out in the cloud, whether it's on a mobile device, wherever it's stored or used. And so we want to bring that visibility into their dashboard visibility as well as at the federal level.
Okay, thank you then. So there have been many reports about sluggish adoption of CDM tools and capabilities. Mr. Cox, what are the persistent obstacles to agency adoption of CDM, and what is DHS doing to overcome those obstacles?
Yes, sir. One of the things we saw with the phase 1 and phase 2 task orders is that we built those with very defined runways. In the case of phase 1, it was a 3-year task order. In the case of phase 2, it was a 2-year task order. What we saw coming in working with the agencies is that we were coming in and they had other priorities on their plate. And so we had to, within the bounds of our task order, work to get our tasks scheduled really quite quickly. And so it was a burden on the agency to make adjustments, get the resources out to get the work done. As you can see, we've made significant progress working with the agencies to get the work done, but we've learned from that lesson. So as we've built out our new contracting approach, CDM Defend, we've worked to build in longer runways. We've worked to build in more flexibility, keeping things focused on a requirements basis, and then working with the agencies to look at different ways to meet those requirements, whether it was through the deployment of a new technology or perhaps with a technology they already have in place where we can bring the visibility into their dashboard.
Okay, but are there additional authorities that you need or additional assistance required from OMB to effectively implement the program?
Yes, we're working with OMB quite closely, taking a look at the OMB memorandum that was put in place in support of CDM. They are working to update that, and so they are supportive of the program and continuing to move it forward. And so I think we've got a good direction there.
Okay, that's good to know. I appreciate the conceptual approach of CDM's phases. However, can I ask, is there a reason they aren't being pursued in parallel? For instance, it seems that phase 4, focusing on data protection, could be implemented at the same time as phase 3. Is there any technical or programmatic reason beyond budget and human resources why it's not being pursued in parallel?
It's a good point. The way we've constructed CDM Defend, it's so that different tasks can occur in parallel, whether they be phase 3, phase 4, whether it be bringing some additional things that were out of scope in phase 1 and 2 into scope and making sure that that can be done. Why we focus now on phase 3 is we've been building up the programmatics around that. We are currently working with our sister staff, Federal Network Resilience, to do proofs of concept of the phase 4 technologies, working with the high-value asset environments. And then our aim is to quickly benefit from those, the outcome of those proofs of concept so we can begin the phase 4 work in parallel to phase 3. Phase 4 is only a pilot. At this point, and then we will work. We have certain programmatic actions we need to take within our department to present the life cycle costs estimates for the program, other important programmatic capabilities around showing that we're ready and able to fund and execute phase 4 work. And so we're currently working that with the idea that by the end of the summer, we will go through that programmatic review within the department.
I haven't technically given you the mic here, but I also serve in the Armed Services Committee and have seen DOD's attempts to implement enterprise-wide cybersecurity acquisition programs. How are you coordinating best practices with them, and what lessons have you learned from their attempts, and newer programs such as DoD Endpoint Security Solutions and Comply to Connect?
We are currently working with our colleagues within DoD. We have a meeting scheduled next week. We've had conversations prior to be able to share our lessons learned on the capabilities that we're deploying, similar to what they're looking at. Learning the lessons from the Comply to Connect implementations within DoD. That's part of the innovation, new technology we want to look at across the federal government. The Comply to Connect technologies, software-defined networking, zero trust networks, et cetera. So we are building that partnership up so that we can share back and forth our best practices, lessons learned, et cetera.
Very good. Thank you all. I appreciate the answers. I have some additional questions that I'll likely submit for the record unless we do a second round. But other than that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. I want to thank Chairman Hurd, Ranking Member Kelly from the Oversight and Government Reform Subcommittee on Information Technology for conducting this joint hearing with us. I want to thank certainly all of the witnesses for your very insightful and valuable testimony today. I want to thank the members for their questions. As you just heard, some members of the committee will have additional questions for some of the witnesses, and so we'll ask you to respond to those in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be open for a period of 10 days. Without objection, the subcommittees stand adjourned.